That's awesome. All right, red and blue teaming. So this is going to be maybe a little bit more advanced than maybe some of the other stuff, right? This is really about elevating our understanding of the adversary and then defending against it with some breach attack simulation capabilities that we'll talk about. So real quick, anybody using MITRE, the MITRE attack framework? Kinda? Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about MITRE, what it is, just to make sure that everybody's in the same lane. And then we'll go through some examples. So I'll do some breach attack simulation. You'll see the outcomes, the results. I am using a little bit of Cisco in this, right? There's some open source stuff. It's Cisco because that's the tool I have access to. You use whatever you want, but I'll show you a little bit about how you go about doing that. At the end of the day, you know, it's all doom and gloom. It really is, and it is really bad out there. There's no doubt about it. All protections fail. Doesn't matter what vendor you go with. Doesn't matter if you go with a single vendor, if you can, which is very difficult to do. The bottom line is those controls will fail. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Like I said, we'll get into MITRE attack. And I believe MITRE attack will drive a defensible architecture that you can stand behind. We'll talk a little bit about the tooling, and then we'll get into some scenarios. Sound good? Ready? Excited? Yeah, so I've been doing stuff for a while, been around. I spoke at Cisco Live. I've spoke at, it used to be called Vancouver Privacy and Security Summit. I've many different BSides. So I've done a lot on the community side. I do have a YouTube channel. There is a lot of agnostic stuff on that channel. Just talking about MITRE, what is it? Why can't I think of it right now? Pyramid of Pain. Right? Yeah, it sounds cool, eh? Cybersecurity has some really cool terms. But Pyramid of Pain, but also some stuff specific to Cisco. All right, all protections fail. So you may have heard today, you need endpoint protection, endpoint detection response. You need all these different things in order to secure the organization. So on the client side, right, on the campus, you'll have things that are plugged in. You have users that plug into Wi-Fi, they'll plug into your network, and you'll have some level of protection on them. Whatever that might be. You might have at least endpoint protection, but hopefully moving to EDR capabilities or endpoint detection response. And you have that installed. But you also have other devices on the network that you can't install an agent. Try to install an agent on a thermostat, right? You can't, right? It's smart, supposedly, but you can't put any control on it. So it sits on the network. It's open. It's available. And if you're lucky, you might have some detection capabilities on the network. Now, you might be saying, of course, Cisco. You're saying the network, right? You're trying to make it relevant in the conversation. But that's not true. The network provides a tremendous opportunity for telemetry and the ability to defend. So it's an opportunity. And listen, as an adversary, if I get on an asset, what do I need in order to move in the network, right? I have to be able to leverage the network to move forward in my journey. And if I have capabilities there that at least can see what might be happening, that's an advantage. And then you have workloads, and this is where the challenge becomes, because you have workloads everywhere. You have them in a traditional data center, in a physical server, you might have a virtual server, you might have a container, it might be in Cloud Service Provider 1, it might be in Cloud Service Provider 2, it might be in all of those areas, right? So how do you secure that? Well, maybe you have some controls that are installed on the workloads themselves with some limitations. So all good. But again, there's nuance. So for example, there's a workload that sits in the data center somewhere, and it's healthcare, and the folks that manufacture that particular software won't allow you to install an agent on it, right? Because it voids their SLA. So there are going to be gaps, and that's all I'm showing here. This is a simplified view. There's always a whole bunch of other controls in play here, but what happens is that an adversary will get in, and they'll land on that one box. That's the first thing. Now, I think I heard the comment that the adversary has to be 100% right. And I hear a lot of people say that. I tend to disagree because I think the defender has to be 100% correct. And I don't believe that. I think the defender does not have to be 100% correct. The adversary does. So it's the opposite, sorry. Why I say that is that an adversary needs certain things in order to be successful. Right? So they need to do certain things to get onto your box, and then onto your box, onto your box, and then on your box, onto a workload, and then on that workload to some. A lot of things have to come in line for that adversary to be successful. If I stop you from getting on that first box, Everything else doesn't matter because you can't move forward. Now, you might say, well, then I'll put all my investments there and we're done, right? No, because that's going to fail. But if I can stop the lateral movement or at least alert on it, then I know something might be happening. So that's what I mean by the adversary has to be 100% correct. The defender does not. So the advantage is the defender. That's my thoughts around it. So anyways, the adversary gets on and they move laterally within that network, right? Because guess what? This whole side is on the same VLAN. And you have an endpoint protection product that had a password on it, or maybe it didn't, and I uninstalled it. And then I moved laterally within that layer 2 network. I didn't even have to cross any other control point in your network. I was able to move around in that entire segment. So that happens. And then maybe I get onto IoT devices, right? There's some vulnerability I was able to scan for. And then eventually, right? Because this is not where I want to be. I don't want to be on the endpoint. I want to be on where the crown jewels are, right? I want to cause havoc, whether that's ransomware, steal intelligent or intellectual data, doesn't really matter. But my objectives is not the endpoint. That first, unless I hit a gold mine, which is going to be pretty rare, right? Like I hit a box, I got access to it, and it has everything I ever needed, and I'm done, right? Which is never going to happen. So the point is that now this all takes place. Let me just build this out a little bit more. There's things that have to happen. Oh, wait, I went a little bit too fast there. Let me just go back. The little delay in the click. I don't know if it's the Google. Huh? Okay, thanks, buddy. Yeah, so when you look up here, what happens is that, that initial access might have been spear phishing, right? There's an attachment. The user clicked it, and bad started to happen. But again, as I mentioned, there's other things, like I have to do privilege escalation. I have to evade your defenses. I have to move laterally in the network. These are all tactics the adversary might leverage in order to be successful, or techniques. So game over, you hear about it all the time, right? There's mentions about even local companies in Saskatoon that get hit. And I like to comment on the SMB, like, why? We're small, we don't get, no, right? You're connected to the network. If I can get access to a small SMB that might have a bigger relationship with a bigger organization, right? Then why go through the front door of that big organization when I can go through the back door of that small organization that doesn't have the controls or the staff to support them? I'll start there and hopefully can make my way into the network. For that bigger organization. And while I'm there, because now I have access, I'm going to steal everything I can, right? I'm going to cause chaos once I'm done whatever I am trying to do. So what happens here is if we're threat informed, we understand the adversary, we understand how they might be targeting us, now we can start to defend against it. And so very simple. If I need lateral movement, what if you can't do lateral movement? So maybe you do get on that host, but you can't move to any one of these other hosts. You just can't. Right? There's no way of lateral movement in that organization. Now, again, there might be holes in this, but in a lot of cases you can drive this outcome. So let's assume that happens. But the problem, though, is that asset still needs access to workloads, right? Because if I secure that where they can't talk to anything, well, what are they doing, right? There's workloads that they have to communicate with. And because they have to, that means that firewall or whatever controls in play here has to be open. That means that workload is susceptible to vulnerabilities, right? Like if there's a vulnerable software running on that system, I can compromise it, right? If I could escalate privilege on the endpoint that happens to have credentials there, I could elevate my privilege on that particular workload. So I can't 100% stop bad from happening, but if you hear about resilience and things like this is now starting to drive towards that because, yes, you might get on that asset, but you're not going to move anywhere else in that organization. You're not going to be able to move anywhere on that campus side, and yes, you have access to that workload, but you're not going to be able to move beyond that. So yes, small compromise, I scope, contain, hopefully remediate, smaller risk, but the business is still operational. But I need to understand what the adversary is able to do. And so I kind of stalled on pyramid of pain. It's even in my deck. For some reason, I had a brain fart. Maybe it's Saturday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't know, maybe. Forgivable, thank you. So anybody hear about the pyramid of pain? Yeah? The one in IT, not maybe that's a different show. Yes. So So anyways, you got, things at this lower level of the pyramid, domain names, hash values, you've got IP addresses. These are what I believe are commodity-based controls, right? It's a bad IP address, it's a bad domain, it's a bad URL. They're usually a symptom of something, right? If there's a connection being made to a bad IP, there's probably something on that asset making that connection, right? So it's a symptom. These are things we need to block. These are what I believe are commodity-based controls, but your firewall is going to do it, your endpoint protection is going to do it. All those tooling are going to hopefully mitigate against this. This is what the industry's been focused on, is that bottom part. What we need to do is climb up higher in that stack. And the pyramid of pain, the higher up the stack you get, the more pain you cause the adversary. That's the goal here. So if I need PowerShell on the Windows machine to move laterally in the network, and I can't access PowerShell, as an adversary, now I have to either be more creative and use a different scripting language on that particular operating system, or I have to bring in my own tools, right? Because you've stopped me from using PowerShell. So that's the advantage. If we can start taking away a little bit of this and that, as defenders, I think we'll have greater success. So MITRE ATT&CK, I'm a big believer. The last 3 years, I've been out promoting the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I do think it provides the defender an opportunity to elevate their ability to defend. I really, really, truly believe this. And so what MITRE ATT&CK framework is a framework. But what it is it's about real world, not what if stuff, right? It's not pie in the sky and all this magical fairy dust stuff. This is real world examples of the adversary being successful in organizations. And it's community led and everybody can contribute to it. It's nonprofit. These are the folks that do the common vulnerability exposure, right? MITRE. So it focuses on adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. And really, it's who is the adversary? Who are they, right? What are their goals, right? The why, and then the methods, the how. That's what it is. It's a great big table of all the tactics and the techniques and how they go about compromising organizations in order to be successful. And then everybody's fed in information about what is that particular adversary's ability to do. And then here are some of the mitigation capabilities that you can implement in your organization to remove risk. There's about in the enterprise framework, there's 14 tactics. And there's probably, I don't know, hundreds to thousands of tactics and techniques and sub-techniques, right? There's a lot of them. But in that, there's only 43 mitigations. So it's not that overwhelming. A lot of people say, well, wait a minute, it's overwhelming to go through. But here's why it's important, okay? This is an analogy. I don't know if you guys probably don't have this here because you guys are, it's crowned for energy, right? So say Alberta or Ontario, right? There'll be somebody knocking your door, usually at dinner time, right? When you're sitting down, they look like this, maybe less suspicious, but kind of like this, right? They have a badge, they look presentable, and you look through and you open the door, and they say, hey, I'm here from the electricity company. Let me see your bill, and I can tell you how to get a better rate over 5 years if you lock in, right? And so yes, so you open the door and you're interested enough. But what if their objective was to gain access to your home, right? Get a level of trust. The trust is you open your door and then they rush in and they steal your TV, your jewelry. All right, you've got a big dog maybe. They're not getting in your door, right? But but they make their way in, right? They've fooled you because you've had a level of trust there. What happens then, they go to another house down the road. What do you think their level of success is that door opening if someone's home? Pretty high, right? And guess what? They go in, they do the same thing. They go to a different neighborhood, okay? Knock, knock, knock. You open the door, and again, trust is gained. And again, I steal jewelry or whatever it is, right? Whatever my objectives are. So that's the success of it. But what happens is each one of these people most likely have called police, right? And so the police have went to each one of them and interviewed them, said, hey, what's going on here? Well, there's an individual with a suit, looks kind of suspicious, but not really, right? Had a badge, right? Clipboard or an iPhone or iPad, right? I guess today it's on iPad, right? And I opened the door and then they rushed in and they're capturing all the details. And then what happens is they send out a bulletin. They say, hey, be careful, suspicious persons, right? But there's some nuance here. But what happens is, if you look at it, this is exactly aligned to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. The robber is portraying to be from a trusted energy company, which happens to be the adversary. Okay. Then you have they want to gain access. So what is their motivations here, right? The tactic. And then what is the technique, right? They have a badge, they look presentable, everything looks good, right? They knock on your door right at dinner time where, you're coming in, you're in a rush, so you're probably, you're not as alert maybe because you want to get back to the table. Anyways, that's the technique. They're using fake credentials to get in. So that's exactly what MITRE does for us as defenders. It gives us the recipe, right? The ingredients of what the adversary is going to do. And there's nuance. And the nuance might be that individual might be a girl, right? Versus a man. Different tie. Might be wearing a ball cap. I don't know, right? But there's nuance in this. So there's nuance in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. An adversary might have different changes in how they might achieve an objective. But guess what? The fake credentials, the knock on the door, right? All of that is still the same. And then what happens is they knock on the door in a new neighborhood. They're aware of it. What happens? They call police and whoop, whoop, right? Game over. So tactic, again, is the why, right? So for example, if an adversary wants to achieve credential access, so I want to get your username and password. That's the tactic. And the technique to do that might be as I've got some creative software that gets installed on your machine and dumps credentials and feeds it back to me. Or I send you an email that has a phishing link that asks you to sign in, right? Whatever. That's the technique. So when we start looking at a defensible architecture, how many people have analyzed the adversaries that target their specific vertical? And I'm going to say not very many would raise their hand, right? So I'm not really asking you, but I'm kind of asking you. And so what I mean by that is if you go and start looking at healthcare as an example, and I'm going to show that in a second, it's going to give you an indicator of the adversaries that have had success in healthcare, that have targeted specifically healthcare itself. And so here's the 14 tactics in the enterprise framework. Everything in red is a capability of that particular threat actor, which is called Gamardon, I think, if I'm saying it right. But initial access, they're using valid accounts. Persistence, they're using Office application startup. Privilege escalation, wait, valid accounts again, right? They're using it twice to escalate privilege and to get initial access. But now I know their techniques, right? For the tactics that they're trying to drive towards. And now I can start mapping that out. So in healthcare, there's 14 threat actors that target healthcare. So if you're in healthcare, if you're in retail, you can go into the MITRE ATT&CK framework, you can type in that vertical, and it'll give you all the threat actors that are associated. But there's some really cool names like Tropic Trooper, Magic Hound, but some of these might be focusing on certain geographies, like maybe Saudi Arabia or the Middle East, if you're in oil and gas, and maybe they haven't targeted you. So again, you would pick these and then focus on the tactics and techniques that these adversaries are doing. And you might be saying, well, wait a minute, these advanced adversaries are not going to target me. Well, no, they are, right? Because they've already proven that they are. And when you start implementing controls for these adversaries, guess what? They apply to anybody else that tries to use that capability, right? Regardless. So now I map this out. I've got all these little red boxes here are the capabilities of all 14 threat actors. So if you look here, reconnaissance all the way down to impact, they have a capability. So when I look at the techniques now, this is on the right side, I can now start lining them up and looking at where my controls should be. Now, for example, if I look at, in this case, all 14 threat actors, they'll use valid accounts. And again, not all of them will use the same things, but in combination, valid accounts for initial access, valid accounts for persistence, valid accounts for privilege escalation, and valid accounts for defense evasion. Yeah. So they're using valid accounts in 4 places. So how do I mitigate against that? How could I stop that piece from happening? Anybody? Oh, did it already? Yeah. Guys, the answer's there. No, I know, it's 2 o'clock. Anyways, mitigate with maybe risk-based authentication. So some level of MFA, right, multi-factor, maybe some risk or conditional access to say where are you connecting from, right? But the goal here is now I need 2 factors. Username and password, yeah, bad, it's better to be passwordless, but that's another story. And second would be now they need MFA, right? They need something that they have on them in order to get authenticated. So now I start removing initial access, persistence, privilege escalation, and defense evasion for those 4 pieces. Now, does that mean I'm done? No, because look for initial access, they have drive-by compromise, exploit public-facing application. So they're going to use these other things. But maybe these other things are less likely to happen than this one. So maybe that's why this is a priority. Or it's a priority because it's in 4 places. And if I could take that away, and I really do believe this provides us things like time-based defense. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But how do I get around that as an adversary? If I have your username and password, but I don't have the device, how do I get past it? Anyone? Because remember, that control is great, but the adversary is always trying to look to get past that control. So what if I MFA bomb you or MFA fatigue? Right? Like what if I constantly, you get a message on your machine that says, hey, you're trying to authenticate, accept or deny. Deny. Hey, you're trying to authenticate, accept or deny. Deny. Hey, you're trying to authenticate, accept or deny. It must be my Office 365, accept. You know that's exactly what happens, right? That's why he's laughing, right? Because he knows people that have done that. And maybe you've done it by accident on yourself, because I know I think it sometimes. I'm going, wait, zero trust? It's always asking me, right? So anyways, so what happens is, so how do I build a mitigating control against that? Well, the adversary's here. They get the code, right? The user has this pop up on their machine, but they don't know the code. The adversary does. So that's how that, again, when you start building it out, now you start adding the controls in the right places, you make it very, very difficult for the adversary to be successful, right? Adversary knows 7518. The victim has no idea what that number is. And hopefully the victim will click on, I'm not logging in, and now you have an alert somewhere, right? Okay, so you may have heard a little bit about attack chains earlier on today a little bit. This is an example of it. This is the opportunity as a defender. This is getting into the weeds, right? But this is the opportunity. So step 0, there's 2 things that could happen here, reconnaissance and resource development. So reconnaissance could be, I'm trying to get your external IP addresses. So how do you do that? How do you stop me from getting that? You can't. Like you can abstract your email and do all that stuff, but you can't stop me from finding out, right? And then resource development might be compromised accounts. So what's stopping me from compromising your personal LinkedIn account? Right? And you might say, well, so what? That's not my company data. No, but now I have friends. Now I have that account with that individual, and now I see all of your contacts, and maybe I send a message over LinkedIn with a PDF that's weaponized to say, hey, read this article, great article, right? I just read it, and now click, bang, bad happens, right? So there's things that you can stop the bad from happening, but for me to compromise that social account, you have no control over that, right? That's a personal account. So now everything moving forward, though, is an opportunity. There might be some little things that you can abstract, but you can't stop it. Initial access, step 1. Execution, and we'll get into the details a little bit here in a second. Persistence, right? How do I stay on the box over a long period of time? I've got privilege escalation. How do I get more credentials or access to that system? Defense evasion, right? How do I get past your controls so it doesn't know that I'm there doing something bad? Now, if I'm logged in as you, guess what? I look, smell, feel just like you, right? For the most part. Discovery and the lateral movement, and then you go to collection, exfiltration, and then finally impact. Impact could be stop a service, could be ransomware, right? It could be data destruction, could be all kinds of different things, right? What am I going to punch you in the face with? Now, well, that's really what it is, right? Bad happens when they're at step 10, it's bad. It's really bad. So now that we see this, so initial access, I don't know if you can see that clear there, but initial access might have a couple of things here, right? And so, you know, there's external remote services. They use that for initial access. So there's some remote service that you get access to that I might be able to gain access to that system for whatever reason. So how do I mitigate that? Well, maybe that's a next-gen firewall capability, right? You just minimize that external remote service access from the get-go, right? Valid domain accounts, we talked about it, risk-based multi-factor authentication. So red means I've got a preventative capability in play. When I look at step 2, execution, they're using WMI, Windows Management Instrumentation. So if I take your ability away from using that, great, but I might not be able to do that. If PowerShell is used administratively in the organization and they need access to PowerShell, or sorry, you need access to PowerShell and you can't restrict it, well, that's on the machine. I have access to it if I'm on that machine as much as anybody else. So in this case, maybe you've got some EDR capability, right? Some behavioral element to help prevent that. Then you look at things like, again, external remote services. So how can I, well, maybe it's a ZTA or zero trust access functionality, right? So you're trying to limit access to that resource over the network. But the bottom line is that there's multiple opportunities here. I don't need to hit every one of these. If I stop this one, right, the external remote services there, then anywhere else they might use that might be very difficult for them to overcome. But the other thing is that now they have to try something else in their arsenal. And when they do that, guess what? Now I've got time-based defense. My tooling gets an opportunity to catch up to the adversary if it's missed it. And second, I'm in a box and I'm trying to punch my way through the box. Guess what I'm doing? I'm creating noise. Right? The more noise I create, the more opportunity you have for your tools elsewhere to find it or detect it. At least you know they're there. So as I go through, green happens to be, maybe I don't have a mitigating control here. I can't roll out MFA right now. I just can't. So what do? Well, maybe we talk about user training. Maybe it's push notifications because they have been getting past our MFA because you've hit accept, right? You didn't hit decline. Again, keep going through this and we start knocking off some of these. Not all of them, but we start knocking off some of these. And finally, whoops, sorry, one click too. Finally, we have something like this. Now, this is a simplified view of an attack chain, right? An adversary needs to be successful. They might have multiple options, so you might get blocked and they overcome it with another capability. But at the end of the day, the adversary has to be 100% right in order to get to step 10. A defender does not. And that's what I mean by that. Okay, fun? Excited? Still there? No? All right. Okay, breach attack simulation. So I think the couple of talks ago, maybe the last talk, she had mentioned pen testing, right? Great thing to do for an organization once, twice a year. It's probably the minimum that you're going to do it. Ton of value in pen testing. This is not a knock towards pen testing whatsoever, but pen testing is only as good as the pen tester and its point in time, right? The moment it's over, it's stale, right? Where breach attack simulation comes in is this is a constant method that I can evaluate my infrastructure constantly, right? Weekly, daily, every change that happens in the organization, I have the ability to test it for at least a certain level of common attacks that an adversary will use, right? Pen testing could be very customized and nuanced, and like I said, there's a ton of value in it. All right, commercial tools for breach attack simulation. You might have heard of AttackIQ, Metasploit, Cobalt Strike, Canvas. But there's a ton of open source, and I would encourage you, if you haven't went and downloaded Caldera, do that. Again, these are from MITRE ATT&CK folks, right? They've created Caldera, a tool, and we'll showcase it here today, that you can leverage to do breach attack simulation tests in your organization. It's open source, it's free. And there's a couple others that you can leverage. All right, so now we know the tools. Let's talk a little bit about it. What is the value of it? Well, first off, it allows us to identify vulnerabilities in the organization, right? Safely. We can do this constant test. It simulates the attack just like the adversary does, and it helps uncover those weaknesses. Once we identify those weaknesses, we can start putting our controls in. The really cool thing here is I can be very creative in the testing that I do, but I can also do testing against the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So if I'm looking for a tactic or a technique, I can actually pick that technique within Caldera or Attack IQ and say, execute that attack against this particular asset and let me know the results. Was I able to defend against it? And we're going to show that today. It highlights where you're able to detect and prevent. So ultimately, what is the most important piece? Detection or prevention? I didn't hear anybody, but detection, right? Because you can't prevent unless you detect, and you're never going to 100% prevent. Now, everybody wants to, and every vendor will tell you, get our stuff and we'll prevent it. The reality is nobody's going to give you a signed agreement that says we'll 100% protect you against everything 100%. It's not ever going to happen. So, but you want to be able to detect it. And if you detect it, there is an opportunity potentially to prevent it, right? Not always, because it depends on where that detection has taken place. Again, it helps you prioritize your investments as well. So if you find an area of weakness that gives the adversary a tremendous opportunity to be successful, then that's probably the area that you want to put a control in place, right? That investment now has been articulated at that point in time. Compliance, again, if you have any regulatory compliance that you're doing, this is evidence-based testing. You've validated the control is working. You could demonstrate your ability to prevent, detect, and respond to security incidents, and then ultimately you can avoid fines and things like that, right? And then continuous improvement, right? Because I'm able to do this more frequent, it's a tool that I have available to me. Now I have the ability to simulate these exercises freely. And because I'm doing these more often, again, I'm able to shore up my capabilities when I find weaknesses. And the other thing that it does is it helps the team understand the adversary and how they may operate. So if compromise happens, your team now starts learning of what to look for next because they know where they are in that stage of an attack in order to be successful, right? If you don't have eyes and ears on the network as an example, and you know they've popped one box, you probably want to look for lateral movement, right? Because they want to move from that initial access that they got on that initial asset. So again, it gives your team the ability to understand that they've been there, they've done it, they start getting a good understanding of how the adversary operates. Now here's a couple of scenarios. So in this one, we're going to use network detection and response. I would say probably most organizations aren't doing much in regards to network detection and response, okay? I think EDR is being leveraged, endpoint detection and response. You've installed, Microsoft, CrowdStrike, Cisco Secure, SentinelOne, right? You've installed those tools. But do you know what the network looks like? Do you know what normal looks like? Can you detect an adversary on the network? Unlikely in most organizations, unfortunately. We're getting better, but we're not there. And this is XDR. And so the point here is we got Caldera, open source, free tool to use, and we're going to live off the land. Does anybody know what living off the land is, right? We all do, right? It's using the tooling that's available and not having to bring in our own tooling. If I have to bring in my own tooling, that means every control that you have in the organization has an opportunity to mitigate. So I'm going to use living off the land. So discovery is the tactic. The technique is network service discovery. Can we detect it? What do you guys think? Well, I tried in your, no, I didn't. Okay, so we have an agent that has Caldera agent installed. And forget about the sound. I know it sounds dramatic, doesn't it? And so then what I did was, okay, maybe I know nothing. We talk about generative AI. So I go on to ChatGPT and I say, hey, create a PowerShell script that scans the entire /24 network based on the network configuration that you are able to pull from the machine, right? And then I want you to scan all common ports for that entire segment. So I just asked ChatGPT to create me a PowerShell script that allows me to run it on an asset and scan the entire network. So I don't have to bring in a tool to scan your network. I can use PowerShell to do that. And not only do I ask it, I say, hey, I'm an idiot. Well, maybe not an idiot, but I'm not familiar with PowerShell. So explain what each command is. And so it went through and here you go. Use it, right? And you know what? It took me a little bit. What I find with these types of tools so far is you can take scripts, you can create scripts, but they're never 100% perfect, right? There's always nuance. And there's one thing around new bands, that dash band that was causing problems. So I said exclude it moving forward, right? The script would never run. But then I said, okay, that's great, but that's in clear text. Can you encode it for me? And so ChatGPT said, well, here's how you encode it. All you have to do is take this new script I'm creating for you, put your original script into this new script, and then run it with the power encode command, right? And listen, the encoding is not something that's going to be hard to determine what the actual command is, but it's obfuscated nonetheless. And so now I have these two PowerShell scripts, and now I know how to run it on the machine. So you might be saying, well, wait a minute, how did you get access to the machine? Well, valid account. Doesn't matter, I got on the machine. Let's assume I've made my way that far into the environment. But now I want to scan the entire segment that that asset is on to determine if there's other areas that I can elevate my capabilities. So I paste that in, paste the script, and I go ahead and run that in PowerShell, and then I get the encoded command, right? So again, copy, open up PowerShell, paste, and now I have this encoded command. Hit enter, and there it is. So now I can take that PowerShell encoded command and run it in PowerShell with dash encoded command, right? And you can't see that string in clear. So, okay, there, we've got it. We go ahead and run this. And you might be saying, EDR is going to pick this up. Well, let's hope it does. But EDR is only as good as the asset it's installed on. And it's only as good as the platform that's available. But you can't scan the network without the network knowing that it's being scanned. That part you can't hide from. Doesn't matter if it's a thermostat, a light bulb, or anything. And so the network was able to see that there was an internal port scan that maybe the device without an EDR capability wasn't able to detect. And again, it's just showing you now that I've got some visibility and there's a little bit more to the story. In this case, because I did multiple tests on this particular asset, it starts building out the attack chain. And guess what? Discovery, credential access, defense evasion, and command and control. It starts associating all of these independent observations from all these different tools. It starts collecting them together to build out that story for you. And now I know, even though I didn't stop it, I know an adversary is in my network scanning the environment. Either that or a skilled user, and then I need to have a talk with that user on why they're doing it, right? But I know something's happening. And I thought, well, wait a minute. I created that PowerShell script using ChatGPT, and I know nothing about it. Let me go into Caldera. And I actually came in here and took those scripts. There's some customized, there was a lot of error that I had to go through and fix as I go along around syntax. But now I can put them in here in Caldera, and I can run this tool now native with Caldera. Now, Caldera is, there's an agent installed on the machine, right? Or any breach attack simulation tool, you install an agent on a machine, and that's how you run the test, right? This is the head end, and then you have clients, and then you run your tests, right? So I was able to come in here, and now I can create an operation. I can schedule this to make sure that my networking and other tools are picking up this noise anytime, and my team is aware of it. So again, it's like having a mini pen tester in your back pocket, right? I'm constantly testing my infrastructure for attacks and simulating this. So here I'm just grabbing that encoded command, and I'm saying run that, and then also run the clear text. And the reason why you want both is you want to see if your tooling has the ability to tell you what's happening in the environment. So can it tell you what the encoded command is? Great, if it can, that's pretty good. And second, it should be able to pick up the clear text. That one's a little bit easier or a little bit more trivial. And I go ahead and run that. It's doing exactly the same thing that I just showed you running it in PowerShell. So there's all the IPs on that network, and if I scroll down to the very, very bottom, I can see the open ports on that network. And once I know the open ports, then probably I want to know what versions and software that's available on that asset, and then I'm going to look for exploits against that vulnerability, and then take advantage of it. That's ultimately my goal. So that's the first one. And again, I'm using open source. I can come and look at this analysis. I can build out reports from this, and it's all free. So pretty cool. And again, you can test anything. Like there are all kinds of MITRE attack capabilities built into the tool. All right, so we're able to detect it. Perfect. That's exactly the outcome we wanted. Now this one, this is a little bit different. I'm using Attack IQ. I'm not going to show you Attack IQ until the end if we have enough time. But I use Attack IQ, and Attack IQ has a test that looks for this particular vulnerability, this content, right? Web script, security view for players, blah, 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 right? I know my intrusion prevention system doesn't have the signature to detect this. I didn't want to show that because if I showed that, then it wouldn't be valuable here, right? If I'm going to block it. And so when you do your testing, you want to do it in two modes. You want to do audit first because you want to see what you could detect if the attack was to run its full cycle. Because if you don't and you block it earlier on, you might be prone to a whole bunch of other tactics and techniques that you have no idea your tooling has the ability to let you know. So you run it in audit first, and then you determine, wait, it catches everything, fantastic. And then you run it in prevention mode to say, how quick do I stop it, right? Hopefully as soon as possible. So this one here, I go to ChatGPT and I say, okay, it's pretty cool. All right, so anyways, audit mode. So I go into audit mode so I can see this test come to fruition. And I see that it's been successful. This is just an indicator. That's all that is. So I know that I failed to detect that test. They were able to get through. So then I go into ChatGPT, and because I'm using Snort, I can say, hey, create an create a Snort signature version 3, look for specific parameters, give it this message, and write that signature for me. Now, when we talk about augmenting your team or your SOC, that's pretty powerful. Because now your SOC can use AI to get them 98% of the way there, maybe 90, right? But get the way there, and then maybe they have to do some modifications. And that's what I had to do here. So I ran this, I go ahead and hit start. And again, I say, listen, I don't know anything about Snort signatures. Can you explain to me what each line does? So I can use it as a learning tool. And so it comes out and it gives me the signature right away. I say, well, wait a minute, tell me what each line does, and it does that, right? Fantastic. Check on time. Am I still good, guys? Yeah. All right, so now it comes out. So it says alert TCP home network to external network, HTTP ports. It tells me what those variables are, right? Flow to server established, right? The flow to the server has to be established. 3 minutes left? Oh, we're not getting to the second part. All right, so anyways, draw this out. Okay, we may get to the other part. Anyways, so now I got that signature. There's a little bit of modification I have to do here. It wasn't perfect, but like I said, it got me 98% of the way there. I won't bore you if I can find my mouse again. Maybe I can't. Weird. Anyways, so I make the adjustments. And then what I do is I go into the firewall, I add this new rule, and I'm going to run the test again. And this time, it's going to detect that test. Let me just see if I can fast forward it. Oh, there it is. Oh, no. I knew it. And so what happens is I've imported, so just believe me on that. I've imported the yeah, no, it worked. So I imported it. Yeah. Yeah. All right, let me show you. I'm just kidding. I got to hit play. If you want access to this stuff after, just email me. I'll get it to you. Even the videos. And look at this. It says intrusion would have blocked because the intrusion policy is in IDS mode, not prevention. But now I know it detected it. It's got the message that I created. And I use ChatGPT to augment my security team's ability to create signatures on the fly with maybe limited expertise. So victory there. So fantastic, right? We were able to detect that. I'll come back to that in a second. There was the thank you because I knew I was going to run out of time. But here's the last piece, right? So if we have 13 minutes, we'll get close to done it. This you can do this for other tools. So that we're going to use Attack IQ. That's a commercial product. I don't care. It's nothing to do with me. I'm using Cisco Secure Endpoint today. That has nothing to do with me. It doesn't matter. Use the tooling that you have. But there's a couple things. It's going to look for behavioral prevention, detection, and then sample analysis. And again, I just want to show you this with a better appreciation of it, because even with these tools, they might be wrong, okay? They might not be 100% accurate. So anyways, this is the MITRE attack framework at the top. Those are the tactics. Below are the techniques that we're going to test in this particular scenario. And what happens here is, let me just fast forward a little bit. What I'm doing here is, again, this is our XDR, but it doesn't really matter. I'm just proving out a couple of things, right? So there's no assumptions that something's missing. I'm showing you what clients installed and what is enabled, right? So it's telling you a little bit about secure endpoint, what's enabled, what's installed, Microsoft, right? There's a collection of telemetry for the device itself. Now that I know that's there and what modules I have, I'm going to go into, in our case, we're going to go into a policy and we're going to make sure that it's running in audit mode. Why? Because we want to run the full test, right? We don't want to block anything too early on. And there's the version that I know that's just been updated. I'm just coming into the endpoint, and very quickly I'm coming to see that audit policy is in place. That audit policy is in place, fantastic. Again, use anything that you have available to you. I go into Attack IQ, and this is a SaaS-based service as well. And I come in and I have to come in and create a new assessment. I create a new assessment, and you can build your own here. You fully customize everything in here, which is really, really cool. And I grab that baseline test for protect policy against Cisco Secure Endpoint. Like CrowdStrike would be in here most likely, and other tools, right? Not just Cisco. And here's the test, right? So the test kind of goes into behavioral protection, dump SAM. This one's a collection of screenshots, keystrokes, clipboard data. And here I can customize things. So if I need to add Active Directory or anything like that, I could put any of those parameters. Or if I want to customize it. So it's very, very flexible in that way. And then what happens here is there's behavioral detection evaluation, and then some samples. So I'm going to go ahead and create the assessment here. And I hit create new. I know you're excited. Me too. All right, now I add the endpoint. So remember, the endpoint has the endpoint detection response tool, but it also has the Attack IQ agent or the Caldera agent that would be installed on it. Okay, and then you have to make sure you exclude that because your antivirus mechanism might actually block that. So you might have to put a whitelist for that particular one. I go ahead in the tool, I run the report. Now the integrations on this, which is cool, it'll actually go back into the tooling to pull the reports back to validate whether or not you had success. The thing is, there was a little bit of nuance. So prevention, you can see it was all red for the most part. Nothing was prevented. Why? Because we're in audit mode, remember? So not prevented, not prevented, not prevented, right? And there was a couple that were prevented, so I have to go back and look at why, but it doesn't really matter. But then I saw this one down here that says not detected. And if I look at it, it's got to do with dark comment. And I thought, well, wait a minute. I'm going to grab that hash, and I'm going to park it for a moment, right? So it was successful, meaning it landed on the endpoint, and then the tooling deleted it from the endpoint. It didn't block it. There's about 15 samples that were tested. That was one of them that was successful. So keep that in mind. I've got that SHA. I'm going to look at the report, and it shows me pretty good detection, right? Detection 100% across, except that ingress tool transfer for that dark comment. I think it was dark comment. It was 90%. We missed one. And again, that's any tooling, right? You might have variances in the success rate. Nobody's going to be 100%. And if I come in and said, pounded my chest and said 100% of everything, you go, well, yeah, he made sure it was 100%. I want to show you in reality that it may not be 100%, but that's okay. But at least I know that now. Now, what I do is I go through here, and this is all the logging. I go back. Actually, look at all this. These are all the things that were detected. Like it's pages, just from that 20 test report for that particular agent. And so what I do is I come in, I look at what is the details here. I want to make sure I'm at the right version change. And then from there on, that's when I know. So the version change was here. And now I can see Mimikatz was ran here. Someone mentioned Mimikatz, the SMB. Justin, I think it was earlier, right? So Mimikatz was used here. And again, was maybe successful, but detected, right? We detected it. And that's the key piece here. And you can see all the stuff. Now, ultimately, we want to block this earlier on. Even the PowerShell commands are included in here, right? If you can't see the command line arguments, then you have a problem because you don't know exactly what it is that they were doing. So if I'm just going to skip through. So this kind of lets us know what took place. And then I went back and I looked at that SHA. And are we good? Okay, all right. 5. We're not that good then. Anyways, So I took that SHA and I went into our malware analytics sandbox and I put in that SHA, and we did know about it. So we do know that that SHA was associated to dark comment. Now I had to figure out why the endpoint didn't, and honestly for this test I don't care, right? Normally I would, but I don't care in this particular test. I didn't dig any deeper. It could be that the reporting engine didn't actually grab the data over. It could have been some reason why we missed it. I don't know. And again, I don't really care. But I would in a real world. So here I'm looking at, we talked about attack chains. Remember that nice little attack chain that went down and showed you everything, where the controls are? This is a visualization of that, right? It starts looking at the processes, to the name, to the email, to the user. You got network detection response, endpoint detection response, identity threat detection response. And now you can see the relationships between bad, which is in red, to any of the assets that it may have been involved with. So a hash to an IP to a domain, an endpoint to a user, right? I get that all collected for me and I can visualize this. As an adversary, there's lots of stuff I have to do. Now I can visualize it. I can see it as a defender. And if I'm doing breach attack simulation, I'm doing it in the safest possible manner, right? I'm not doing it when an incident is occurring, which is the worst place to learn. So then I go through and I run this test again, okay? So I'm just gonna fast track it because of that 5-minute limit here. I rerun that test, again, in protection mode, and exact same thing, but what's different here is I start seeing errored. Now this is what I meant by the tooling. Errored means that it didn't get a determination one way or another. And what happened was, the defensive tool in this case happened to remove it so fast enough and earlier on that the tooling didn't know what happened, right? So which is a good thing. But this is what I meant by taking it with a grain of salt, right? You have to come back to this. What happened here? You have to come back to this. You can pull this report and validate whether or not you detected it and prevented. So what happens here? This is the report. Look at this. Missed all of this. It says it missed all of this piece here, which is credential access. It missed PowerShell over here. And it missed that one SHA, right? That I talked about earlier. And so you would think that you failed that test. You might even question your endpoint. But when you go back into the tool, I show you in the video, I go back in the tool, we actually did block it. So it was blocked. The report never came back into the tool. And I could reach out to Attack IQ and figure that out. It's probably something simple, right? But it didn't come back into the tool. And so I've just manually modified this to say prevented, right? But again, at least I know where the failures may have occurred and then validated if they were true or not outside of the tool. And that's it. That's it. It's really over now. Well, it's not that over. I think you have one more session, right? And then closing. Yeah. But it's almost over. Anyways, thanks.